Hey guys, welcome to Boxing Squared for boxing news and views from around the internet. The dust has settled on a very busy weekend in the heavyweight division. 3 of the top prospects were involved in the weekend's action, and I have some extended thoughts on the wins by Daniel Dubois, Joyce, and also Tony Yoka. And I wanted to swing back at the end of this video just to check in on my top 6 prospects in the heavyweight division. Are they still my top 6? And just a couple of thoughts on each. But starting with Daniel Dubois, who clearly scored, in my eyes, the most impressive victory of the weekend. It's quite interesting, this performance against Nathan Gorman, in a fight on paper which was seen as a very close and competitive fight, he completely dominated it. And it really is true in the heavyweight division in boxing more generally. One performance, be it good or bad, can totally alter fan perspectives pretty much overnight. There is a wave of positive sentiment towards Daniel Dubois now that, some of which was there before, but it had certainly drifted off after the performance against Kevin Johnson. That was in 2018. He fought Johnson, he was taken the distance, and it kind of deflated some of the hype train for Daniel Dubois. People were questioning how good was Daniel Dubois. Not all fans, but there was a section of fans, especially some supporters of Anthony Joshua, who sort of said, they shouldn't have ever been mentioning Joshua and Dubois in the same sentence. But after this win over Nathan Gorman, which was categoric, he outboxed the boxer, controlled Gorman behind his jab. It was interesting in the build-up because you may recall in some of my build-up coverage, I did note that they were really pushing Nathan Gorman and some of what they were doing with the promotion quite hard in the final weeks. I thought some of the polls were maybe a bit loaded to get an outcome which favoured Gorman. And as a result, the closer the fight got, a lot of people started to warm up to the idea that, Nathan Gorman may be able to beat Daniel Dubois, that he would be the man to beat Daniel Dubois. But as we found out, he was not. Quite a bit of late money came in on Gorman, and in terms of the betting stakes, it ended up being relatively even in the end, even though the fight did not pan out that way. And it's a real kickstart for Dubois' profile again. He's now 21 years old. He's the British champion. He's the English champion, the Southern Area champion. He's got a youth title. He's got a whole screed of belts. And this win has really reinvigorated the Daniel Dubois brand. He may not be the best talker out of the ring. He's probably never going to win us over in that sense in terms of being a conversationalist. But in terms of the in-ring performance, he does his talking in the ring. And that's really where it does count, where it does matter. So I think his promoter, Frank Warren, is going to be very happy with what happened. Obviously, his other fighter, Nathan Gorman, sort of took the loss there, and a relatively bad loss. But Frank Warren, in terms of Daniel Dubois, I think he will feel that Dubois, at least with fans, is back on track in people's minds and on to bigger and better things. And in terms of Nathan Gorman, and you can see here on screen a couple of different posts that he's put up on a social media, Twitter, Instagram, all that sort of stuff, explaining what happened, and he's back to the drawing board and, thanking everyone for the support. A lot of the sort of things that fighters do come out and say in the wake of a loss, and there will be a bit of soul searching here. He's got to go back to the drawing board because he looked very short on ideas, outboxed. He went away from boxing with his much shorter reach than Daniel Dubois, which proved key in the fight. Dubois was able to control Gorman relatively easily enough. Gorman falling short with a lot of he was going for this left hook, which Daniel Dubois would sort of fire back over the top with a right hand. Gorman's tactics, a bit questionable, but I guess, it's easy to sort of look at these things in hindsight, but I was surprised that he didn't sort of, utilize movement, utilize boxing in those early rounds. Instead, he opted to trade with Daniel Dubois and try to go to war in different spots. Not sure that was the right tactic, especially early in the fight. Ultimately, I guess it's kind of moot because he lost, and there will be all manner of things they'll be examining with him, but it does sort of make a lot of us wonder, well, how good is Nathan Gorman? Because that's the other question. Was this really a 50-50 fight? It was billed as one or something close to it, and on paper it looked like it might be similar opposition. It does make me wonder, where is Nathan Gorman's ceiling? Because he's got a lot of work to do. I think on the strength of that performance, he will struggle to beat some of the guys in the top 20, even if he does get better. And the 73-inch reach, which is one of the shorter reaches in the heavyweight division, that could be a problem for him. He's listed, I think it was at 6'4.5", although he's closer to 6'3", I believe. That 73-inch reach, we saw that was a disadvantage against a guy who had 5 inches on him, Daniel Dubois, a 78-inch reach. It just proved to be something that he couldn't overcome. After that performance, I'm not convinced about how far he can go. But I guess that comes back to, one performance, good or bad, does alter fan perspectives. I had Gorman somewhere, between 10 and 15 in terms of prospects where I sort of ranked and rated them. So he is one of the guys that actually did have a little bit of buzz, a bit of hype, and because he's been out of the UK where the heavyweight scene has been a bit more prolific, he's been getting more headlines than other guys who I do believe are better than Gorman, and will probably go further than Nathan Gorman, but that sometimes just happens in a market where there is more boxing fans and the scene is a bit hotter than elsewhere, where you may have 1 or 2 notable fighters in a country, whereas obviously in the UK right now, it's one of those locations where it's a bit of a hub for boxing, and that's good for boxing. And I guess that will lead some to ask the question, how much credit can you give Dubois for the win? Some of that's only going to be answered over time. Nathan Gorman needs to come back. His career will ultimately, and the wins within it, will dictate how much stock historically people will give to the Daniel Dubois win over Nathan Gorman. In terms of Joe Joyce, I want to move on to him. It was a good win. The scorecards, they were certainly wide. I had a lot closer. I had it 6-6, but, minus the point deduction, I guess that was maybe a questionable point deduction. I still had Joyce winning by a round if you minus that point deduction. But there has been a vein of commentary from fans and others that have been focusing on the faults of Joe Joyce, as opposed to giving him the credit that he deserves for the win. We can't forget, Bryant Jennings was arguably about top 20, on the bubble of the top 20, either just inside or just outside. So beating a guy who was top 20 is actually quite an achievement for a guy who only had, 9 or 10 fights under his belt at the time that he fought Jennings. 9 fights, I think. I mean, Jennings himself said in an interview after the fight, Joyce's pressure and volume, it did prevent him from doing some of the things that he wanted to do. It's one of those sort of situations I think we've noted with Bryant Jennings. He needed to do more. It was that sort of Adrian Broner syndrome. What work he was doing was actually quite nice. There just wasn't enough of it. He landed some very eye-catching and telling punches, hurt Joyce early in the fight in that first round, and he did do some good things throughout the fight, but it just wasn't enough. And maybe some of the lack of recognition for Joyce, it could be a style thing. In his case, instead of a flashy style, he's more a guy who's more focused on results. It's a sort of substance over style. He's getting decent wins with his mix of pressure and volume, but he looks a little bit ungainly, looks hittable, looks like he might be able to be beaten, but he's just gone and beaten a guy who was one of the best in the world, someone who was about top 20 in the world. I mean, I guess a loose parallel for sort of similar type criticism might be someone like a Deontay Wilder, and not in a power sense, because Joe Joyce, I think we've established, doesn't hit with one punch snap like Deontay Wilder, but Wilder's unorthodox style, it was trashed for years and years and years, and it still is by a legion of fans. I mean, ultimately, winning is winning, and Joyce will still be able to win some tough fights with the way that he does fight. But in saying all that, I mean, the defense, he is open, he can be hit, and Jennings was able to have more than a few moments of success, just not enough to win that fight. But someone who was able to make more of opportunities that Joe Joyce presents, someone who's a good counterpuncher, someone who's a good mover, and I think we all expected Jennings didn't actually move nearly as much as he probably was, many people expected him to. But someone who can move, counterpunch, and someone with a big punch who can really crack, it will give Joe Joyce some issues because he's not impenetrable. We saw he was hurt to the body early in the fight, and I think that will encourage other heavyweights that face Joe Joyce to invest to the body. There will be questions asked about, can Joe Joyce be hit to the body and stop to the body? And Jennings, not a huge puncher, but he really had Joyce in trouble in that fight in the first round, and Jennings probably didn't make enough of it, didn't jump on Joyce as well as he could have. And Jennings himself, he's not actually happy with the result. As I mentioned in the post-fight review and sort of glanced over earlier, it's one of those things where the cards were wide. Jennings, see here on screen, just watched the fight for myself, not pleased with the decision. If it was going to be anything, let it be closer than what it was. And I think there was quite a few people who were sort of in that boat that felt that Jennings, through what he was doing, with the counter-punching, landing the more clean, effective, and often eye-catching work, that he was winning some rounds. I had it close on my scorecard, but you'd turn a round or two around, 7-5, something for Joyce. I didn't think Jennings did enough to, get a clear decision for him. But in terms of it being 6-6 on my scorecard, yeah, I could see 7-5 for Joyce. And once you minus the point, it becomes a little bit further away. I didn't have a problem with the 115-112 card. That seemed to be more in the realms of possibility. But Jennings, I think, is right to be a bit unhappy, especially with that 118-109 card, which is only giving him 2 rounds of the fight. And you clearly had to give him the first round because he had Joyce in trouble. So they're telling us that he only won 1 more round in the entire fight, in the rest of the 11 rounds. I can't see it at all. That was a horrific scorecard, and the other one, what was it, 117-110? Not much better. I don't have a problem with Joyce winning, but those 2 cards, certainly a lot wider than I was expecting. And I thought that point deduction would be crucial, could swing it to Joyce, but ultimately it did not matter. So I can fully sympathise with Bryant Jennings, who obviously was hoping to get through this one, get a win, re-establish himself as a top contender, because after that, you do have to ask the question, what next for Bryant Jennings? But this is not that video. And Tony Yoka, the other guy who was in the ring at the weekend, good win over Alexander Dimitrenko. Again, the questions about Dimitrenko, did he really want it? Was it a soft out? They sort of come to the fore, but having him on Yoka's record for his 6th fight is actually a pretty good achievement, and he'll be on to bigger and better things. After a year out, he looked relatively sharp, he was in pretty good form, and it sort of brings me to my top 6 prospects. I named them early in 2019. There was no specific order for some of them, although I did note that out of the bunch, Filip Hrgović was the guy that I had at the top of my prospect list. And the rest of the other 6 are Daniel Dubois, F.A. Ajagba, Tony Yoka, Joyce, and also Arslanbek Makhmudov. I do have to kind of ask myself the question now, is the list still the same? And the only reason it would change is Daniel Dubois and Joyce, are they still prospects? Is Joyce, after beating a contender or a fringe contender in Bryant Jennings, is he still regarded as a prospect? And you could argue the same for Nathan Gorman. Is Daniel Dubois now a fringe contender? But, in terms of if they're still prospects, well, my top 6 remains the same. And overall, they've all had, so far, some decent performances in 2019. This was the first fight for Yoka of 2019, beating Dimitrenko. Good name to have in a 6th fight. He looked pretty good in there. And in terms of the others, Joyce, well, he's gone through Berman Stavern, Alexander Ustinov, and now Bryant Jennings. That's a pretty decent 6 months' work. Some of those names are a bit faded and jaded, Stavern and Ustinov, but as a record builder, that, looks pretty good for the historical record, a former top contender and a former champion. And Joyce, he obviously is going to be on to bigger and better things, and he may not be the prettiest fighter in terms of what he does in there, but he's proving to be effective so far. He certainly is beatable, but matched right, he could win some decent fights. Makhmudov, he's actually had 3 fights so far in 2019, and he's a prospect who is definitely flying under the radar. He's campaigning up in Canada, so I think a lot of the eyes of the boxing world, the boxing media, not necessarily on him, but he's certainly one to watch. Daniel Dubois just re-established himself, if there was ever any question, not in my mind, because I never saw the Kevin Johnson fight as a bad thing in terms of him being pushed 10 rounds. I thought that was an opportunity for him to learn. I thought maybe some of the hype had outstripped his performances, and now we saw probably the most complete performance against some solid opposition in Gorman, the most complete performance of his career. And Filip Hrgović, he's had the one fight so far. It was one round, so it's hard to judge him on what he's done. But, I still believe that he is the best of the current crop. But, as I say, I've got 6 guys who I'm really watching closely, who I believe are going places in the next couple of years, will be vying for titles. Who are your top prospects? Who would you have in your top 5 or 6? And what do you make of some of what's been going on, what's been said? Is the criticism of Joe Joyce fair? Should he be getting more credit for what he actually did to Bryant Jennings? And Daniel Dubois, is the buzz now rocking again for him after the Scoreman win? Drop a comment, loud and often. Hit like, hit subscribe. Follow me on Twitter, boxing_squared. I'm out.